Welcome to the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming. This week, Congress will vote on whether to extend a lifeline to a broken domestic industry, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. The same companies that fought seat belt requirements in the 1960s, airbags in the 1980s, and fuel economy for more than 3 decades have returned hat in hand, unable to survive the months without a taxpayer intervention. Once untouchable symbols of American industrial might and ingenuity, it has become clear the Detroit Three have ceded leadership to the innovators and are now running in fear. Consumers and businesses around the world are tightening their belts to survive the current economic crisis, and some are being driven to bankruptcy. But make no mistake, the fundamental reason the Big Three need life support today is their inability to move from car 1.0 to car 2.0 over the past half century. A business model premised on bigger cars, wider highways, and more oil is a failed equation. Any recovery of these companies will require more than just fresh cash. It will require a change of culture, a culture that answers challenges with innovation rather than lobbying and litigation, a culture that tries new ideas rather than crushing them. I believe Detroit can be reborn. The brain power and technical brilliance are still there. The hard-working men and women in the factories are willing to sacrifice and do their part to ensure the company's survival. The domestic industry needs to pick itself up and use this moment as an opportunity to transform, not incremental change, but a total conversion that reorients these companies towards raising the standards of automotive excellence and reversing decades of decay and complacency. But the deal must be a fair one for the taxpayers, and it must be a policy supportive of innovation and technological change over the long term. And it must destroy forever the industry's fear of change. I have reviewed the pending draft legislation that would make available $15 billion in emergency loans and require the Big Three to withdraw pending lawsuits against the states that support adopting California's greenhouse gas emission standards. I commend that provision and strongly believe that Congress must go one step further and grant the waiver to California, which would allow California, along with 13 other states that want more efficient, less polluting vehicles, to require them. Recent analysis by the National Resources Defense Council of the plans submitted to Congress by Ford and General Motors shows that these companies are likely to achieve the California targets by 2015. It only makes sense to put into law what companies have said in their plans they are going to do anyway. That is accountability. Last year, as part of a landmark energy bill, Congress enacted a $25 billion program to help the auto industry transition to building the efficient, high-tech cars of the future. It's the Green Car Factory Fund. That's really what we should call what we're doing. However, due to President Bush's intransigence on using a piece of the $700 billion financial bailout to pay for auto industry package, we are now forced to raid the Green Car Factory Fund. This is like borrowing from a kid's college fund. The program represents the technological future of our nation's transportation sector. This fund must be replenished, and it needs to happen soon. Failure to repay it in a timely manner will mean more of the same. Car 1.0 and the vehicles of the future will remain distant dreams, and our foreign oil dependence will only intensify. We are very fortunate to have a panel of experts before us today that understands the problem the industry is facing and has a vision for its future. I thank them for being here, and I look forward to hearing their views. I would now like to recognize the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Miller, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I certainly want to thank you for holding this hearing today, this very important hearing on the energy independence implications for the proposal to extend emergency bridge loans to the domestic auto industry and really what it will mean to the industry as well. And I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel very much. And I appreciate the comments that you made, Mr. Chairman, in your opening statement, and I would say that the domestic auto industry will take the challenge that you've laid before us and other members of Congress have laid before our industry as well. And I think to put this in perspective, I would like to just point out and ask that we would consider for a moment the entire history of this very cornerstone industry and really what it has meant for the United States of America. Actually, during World War II, I mean, I come from Southeast Michigan, and everybody there, of course, everything ratchets off the auto industry very much for our state in full transparency. But during World War II, Michigan was known as the arsenal of democracy, and people have heard us say that. But it's because when our nation and our freedom were in dire jeopardy, our domestic auto industry literally had the manufacturing capability to build the armaments that led the entire world to peace. You had Henry Ford churning out B-24 bombers 1 an hour at Willow Run, which is still a functioning airport there in Southeast Michigan. We actually didn't even build vehicles for 2 years during the war effort because we were so totally engaged in the war effort with whether it was planes or tanks or jeeps or everything that our nation needed, really, to be able to protect and expand freedom and liberty and democracy. And I think that should be pointed out. As well, when you think about the middle class of America, I think it would be a very difficult argument to be made that AIG or Citigroup or whatever have created the middle class of America. They may have created the upper class or assisted with the upper class, but the middle class was really created by the domestic auto industry. When you had millions of Americans who joined the middle class, they got quality health care, they earned secure retirements, and were able to send their children to college and build a better life. And I think that much of what has happened to the auto industry, they have not created. Some of, obviously mistakes have been made, but everything that's happened has not been, the problems have not been created by them. Many of the problems that they're facing have been in large measure because of what has happened on Wall Street. And I would also point out again in this historical look back in history, really, to remember after the absolutely horrific attacks on our nation of 9/11, at a time when the terrorists really wanted to bring our economy to collapse. That was a big part of why they attacked our nation in the way that they did. It was the domestic auto industry, led by General Motors, I would point out, who came out with the Keep America Rolling program. As we recall, they offered zero-interest financing and rebates, et cetera, to keep people working and economic activity going so that we would deny the terrorists one of their primary goals, again, crippling our national economy. And now the domestic auto industry is leading the way to new technology and innovations that will build the auto industry of the future. Innovations that will provide dramatic leaps in fuel economy and which will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make America much more energy independent. General Motors and Ford and Chrysler have already invested billions of dollars in these technology. In fact, Ford is estimating by 2011, 50% of all of their vehicles will either be hybrid or flex fuel, which is a wonderful statistic to be able to talk about. Additionally, General Motors is making great progress toward the introduction of the Chevy Volt, which will be the first extended-range electric-powered vehicle that is expected to be in showrooms in 2010. And the domestic auto industry has already created many other revolutionary technologies that will lead us to the auto industry of the future and the energy independence that all Americans desire. If any one of these companies were allowed to fail, it would not only have catastrophic effects on our economy and the loss of American jobs, but those very same technologies that these American companies are on the verge of producing that will make America the technological leader of the new green automotive technology and that will help foster our goal of energy independence will not reach the American consumer. We'll lose the progress made on innovative projects such as the lithium-ion battery and other fantastic opportunities, and we will abdicate Americans' leadership positions to foreign competitors. If we truly want energy independence in America, led by American innovation that creates good American green-collar jobs, then we do need to act on this bridge loan and act now. Could I have another minute, Chairman?
Without objection, yes.
Thank you. We certainly heard from the CEOs of the big three auto companies again late last week, and they've submitted quality plans to Congress on how they would use these loans and how they're progressing toward the technologies that all of us are desirous of. And there certainly seems to be a consensus building now about the bridge loan, and I look at that obviously as a very, very important thing. I believe that the bridge loans will allow some breathing room until the new Congress and the new administration can take office next year to work on longer-term solutions that will establish a much more vital industrial policy in this nation that can help our entire manufacturing industry to thrive. And we all know that doing nothing is not an option. We do not want the demise of the big three automakers, but also many of the suppliers, which are leading as well toward the technological innovation that I've just talked about. We have a great panel here today. I certainly want to in particular welcome Mr. Richard Curlis, who joins us. He's the Chief Technical Officer of MAG Industrial Automotive Systems, which is an international machine tool manufacturer and has substantial operations in my district as well. They are actually the only remaining U.S. powertrain supplier to the automotive industry, and they are the third largest machine supplier in the world as well. Again, I look forward to Congress voting affirmatively on the bridge loan. Hopefully that will happen in the next couple of days, and I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses. Thank you.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you. Thanks for the chair for having this hearing. You know, we cannot rescue companies today if they are going to die tomorrow. And I believe that unless we adopt whole new propulsion systems, whole new drivetrains, whole new systems of energy and fuel, that's what's going to happen to our domestic auto industry. And I am hopeful that in the next several months, not just this week, but several months, the Congress will respond to this magic moment where we will either see the ultimate demise of our domestic auto industry if it does not adopt these whole new generations of propulsion systems and fuels, or the U.S. assuming, again, its rightful place as the most innovative industrial engine in the country or in the world. I want to point out what is at stake right here. I'm looking at a Wall Street Journal article of October announcing that the Chinese BYD company would begin sales in November of their all-electric car with a range of 110 kilometers when fully charged. We look at the Renault company that is signing contracts with the Better Place company that is now totally electrifying the transportation fleets of Israel, Australia, Denmark, and now San Francisco. We have to get in this game nationally, or we will be left at the starting post with bridges to nowhere. And so I want to point out that I am hopeful that this Congress will adopt the measures that will assure that the United States gets in this international game at the last possible moment. Let me give you an example why I think it's the last possible moment. We have a company that makes lithium-ion batteries in the Midwest, and right now it's the only potential manufacturer domestically of lithium-ion batteries. They got an offer for about $300 million from China to essentially move their company to China. We are in the cusp of trading addiction to Middle Eastern oil for addiction to Chinese lithium-ion batteries. So we need to make sure that this industry responds to this opportunity by going to the future, not being tied to the past. I've sent a letter November 17th. I'll submit it to letter to Chairman Frank, suggesting 6 measures: an open fuel standard, investments in alternative fueling infrastructures, energy efficiency requirements, a cash for clunkers program, full funding for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and a federal procurement programs. Those measures will assure the United States it doesn't get left at the post in this international competition. Hope we'll get this job done. The future of this industry depends on it. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate your appearance here before this committee, and hopefully you will provide us with information, ideas, and proposals that will help us as we move into some very difficult times. I'm on the Financial Services Committee as well, and we struggled before we approved and sent on this $700 billion package. Most of the people around the country believe that Congress voted on AIG, and we voted on Bear Stearns. And while that troubles me, because most people are not really looking at the process, I'm more troubled because we, as we often do, have begun to major in minors. You know, the big talk is not about what's important, which is, I think, coming up with alternative forms of energy as it relates to automobiles, but we're talking about how people arrived in Washington. I think it's dumb to fly in if you're going to ask for money in a private jet, but that's irrelevant. The issues that we need to deal with, I think, we're going to deal with here. I mean, after all, those of us on this committee usually don't fly our planes in to meetings. We'll just take commercial airlines like regular people. But I am concerned about what we need to do to make the automobile industry viable. I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. We have 2 plants in my district. 7,200 people work there, not to mention all of the people who are connected to the manufacturing arm of General Motors and Ford. And I'm not interested in seeing them lose their jobs, which I think will impact all kinds of other industries there. But the package should not be limited to only loan emergency credit to the big 3 auto manufacturers to get out of this short-term crisis. It should also encourage our American companies to further retool their plants and produce much more energy efficient, higher mileage cars that are less prone to the volatilities of the oil market. Everyone is for progress. It's the change they don't like. And the proposals that we are going to have to embrace will require change. Things cannot continue as they have gone. I do think that there have been some efforts made, but I think that we have clearly not moved as quickly as we could have to put on the highways the kinds of cars that Americans are buying with titles like Toyota and Datsun. And so as we go through this hearing, you will, of course, be asked in any number of ways what you would recommend. Closing down the automobile industry in this country is not an option. No one would burn down their house to get rid of a rat. No one would cut off their nose because they're having a bad hair day. I think that if we cannot see through this, then this nation is not as great as we all believe it to be. And so we look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The situation today is very frustrating because the big 3 have fought us tooth and nail against producing the kind of cars that we need to make to meet America's needs. As mentioned by the chairman, they filed lawsuits, they flooded the Congress with lobbyists, and all this is to fight change and innovation, and including California's clean air laws. They filed lawsuits, and they've prevented us from moving forward on that score. So now, today, they're sitting here demanding billions of dollars, or else they're going to lay off 5 million workers. And you know, this is a significant threat. Part of my district was the epicenter of the financial crisis that we're facing. We've had 10% unemployment for decades, so we know economic pain, and we don't need any more of it. Now, before we make decisions, what we're going to be making this week, I want to hear from what the panel has to say, what the alternatives look like, what we can decide to do besides giving billions of dollars to the big 3. What alternatives are there out there that make sense for us? So I'm looking to you to answer that question, and also We heard this morning that the auto industry got some credit for keeping the nation rolling after 9/11, but I can tell you what they did was perpetuate our dependence on imported oil. So we need to look at this as an opportunity to transform our transportation system in a way that meets the needs of the 21st century. So a lot of sitting on your shoulders to inform us of what we can do. Thank you very much.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now turn to our very distinguished panel. Our first witness this morning is Joan Claybrook. She is the president of Public Citizen, where she has been a consumer advocate and overseer of good government for more than 25 years. Before that, she was the administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the Carter administration, a period during which fuel efficiency and auto industry bailouts were also hot issues of the day. We are honored to have you here with us, Ms. Claybrook. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like my entire testimony submitted for the record. This is on, right?
Without objection, it will be
Oh, no, it's
included.
not, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like my entire testimony submitted for the record. I'm going to adjust it a little bit because the legislation that is now on the table to be enacted by the Congress this week has just come out. I didn't have a chance to deal with that in writing my testimony. I would like to say that I have worked on auto industry issues since 1966 when I first came to Washington, D.C., and I worked for a member of this committee on the legislation creating the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And within 3 months of getting here, I was nicknamed the Dragon Lady by the auto industry because I was pushing for federal regulation of safety of this industry. I was interested to note that just this week, the General Motors published an ad in Automotive News apologizing to the public for its failure to carry out its obligations, really, to the public for fuel economy and other improvements in their vehicles. I think that what I'd like to just mention particularly is that we do favor having a bailout of this industry, but a bailout with lots of conditions. And those conditions are listed in my testimony. Most important in those conditions should be that there is strong and tough oversight to make sure that this industry uses the money well and comes to the conclusions that the American public wants. We did not favor taking the money out of the 2007 law, Section 136, which is the Innovative Fund, because we believe that that's an extremely important fund to help not only the manufacturers but the suppliers who are the real innovators in this industry. And we did talk to Speaker Pelosi's office, and she said that the money would be refunded through the stimulus program that's coming forward. And so that makes us feel more sanguine about that. So the three areas that we are concerned about are accountability, and with a car czar of stature who will oversee this, and also to make sure that there is a return on the investment to the public by the improvements in vehicles, and then particularly important safety and environmental considerations. Now, I looked at the bill, and I would just like to highlight the things that are not in the bill that we think should be in the bill. And I'm sorry they're not in my testimony because we didn't have a chance to read it then. The first is there's nothing about safety in here, and the auto manufacturers for years have complained that the reason they couldn't make more fuel-efficient vehicles is because it would cause unsafe vehicles, and that's malarkey, because most of the improvements in fuel efficiency come from technology, and it's not all smaller vehicles, plus the fact that with the safety improvements such as airbags and so on, and the structure of the vehicles that absorb the energy of the crash, safety is about the same for most vehicles today that are manufactured today, including the smaller size vehicles. So that safety is a technology issue as well. We think it ought to be a piece of this bill. It ought to be mentioned. Secondly, on page 7 in the legislation, it's subsection 6A1B. There's a definition of interested parties, and it has employees and retirees and trade unions and creditors and suppliers and auto dealers and shareholders, but it doesn't have anything about experts on emissions and fuel economy and safety. And we think that ought to be in the definition of an interested party, because that's what this bill is all about, is the failure of the manufacturers to really listen to the people who have advocated this for so many years. Third, we think that the so-called dual fuel credit, which is a 1.2 mpg credit that the manufacturers got stuck in the law many years ago for a very discrete short period of time and then was extended by the Energy Act, should be eliminated, because in calculating their fuel economy, if they have a dual fuel vehicle, they don't have to meet 1.2 mpg of the required standard. And in the NRDC calculation, Mr. Chairman, that you used, they presumed that they didn't have that 1.2 mpg. We believe, as you do, that the waiver should be granted in California and just be done with. I think in the new administration that they're going to grant that waiver at EPA. Why not take care of it now? One of the most important things is that the auto industry has made promises to have all airbags in all cars by 1975, the President of General Motors, Ed Cole, said. Promises to have greater fuel efficiency. All the auto manufacturers said in 2000, by 2005, they'd have a 25% increase. Then they didn't do it. And then they said they were going to have side head airbags, and then they didn't do it. They did it in some vehicles. Again and again, there have been promises that have not been carried out. Anything that we want these manufacturers to do should be in the law. It has to be in the law, because if it's not done, then organizations like Public Citizen and NRDC and others can sue and force this to happen. And there won't be the delay that there traditionally has been when there have been promises and everyone's relaxed and said, great, they're going to do it, and then they don't do it. Another thing that I think would be really important to put in here is a requirement that federal procurement and an encouragement for fleet procurement by private companies purchase the best vehicles that these manufacturers make. Because I did that when I was head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to get airbags on the highway. And Ford Motor Company, for example, agreed to make 5,000 airbag cars before airbags were generally available to the public. It's a good help to the manufacturers to have federal procurement of their better vehicles. I believe that there ought to be a person from the federal government on the board of directors of each of these manufacturers that gets a bailout loan, because it's on the board of directors that you really see as much of the inside of a company as you're ever going to see. And that was something that the UAW had worked out with the Chrysler bailout, and I think it ought to be in this legislation. Those are the major things that I think are missing. Oh, yes, finally, the last thing is that the requirement for meeting fuel economy here is only to meet the 2007 law, which is a meager provision, as the chairman and I have debated on a prior occasion. It's 35 mpg by 2020, and that's not enough. And we've been talking about having 25% above that. That's not, at least the way I read this bill, it's not in this bill. And it should be in this bill, that if they're going to get these loans, they've got to go beyond the 2007 law and do at least a 25% increase. Now, that's what they say in their plans they're going to do, right? But that's in their plans. And remember, promises, promises. They do promises, promises. We don't know that that's ever going to happen. So the other point and the other reason for doing it is that the manufacturers, when I first went to see Ford Motor Company, one of the vice presidents pulled out this long drawer, and he had a list of all the requirements that they had to meet, and he said, this is how we make our vehicles. We meet these requirements. Well, if it's not in the law, it's only a promise. It's not going to be on that list. So let's make sure it's on the list and make it a requirement in the law. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Claybrook, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Reuben Munger. He is the co-founder and chairman of Bright Automotive. His Indiana-based startup company is developing a high-volume, purpose-built, highly efficient plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. We look forward to your testimony, Mr. Munger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Bright Automotive appreciates the opportunity to testify before you this morning. Chairman Markey, I'm Reuben Munger. I'm chairman of Bright Automotive. We are, as you mentioned, a startup automotive company based in Anderson, Indiana. I have a written statement and ask that it be submitted for the record, and I'll summarize that statement here. Our statement also provides written answers to some of the committee's questions. I'm joined today by John Waters, Chief Executive Officer of Bright, and Lyle Shuey, Vice President of marketing and sales. Both gentlemen have over 20 years of automotive experience. This is a typical situation among our team. It includes experienced members with time at Chrysler, General Motors, Delphi, Johnson Controls. The key aspect of this industry is there are experts who understand and know how to deliver on what this country needs in the way of advanced vehicles. We're at a unique moment of time where there's an alignment between the national and industrial interest. The goal here is for me to discuss a little bit about what Bright has found to be possible. We're responding to a congressional mandate and to a public challenge to make better vehicles that are more efficient, that are cost-effective, and that are greener, and by building those vehicles to provide new, sustainable jobs in the automobile industry. Bright is a startup company whose mission is to bring to market advanced vehicles. We were launched as a standalone company out of the Colorado-based Rocky Mountain Institute, the outcome of a long-standing nonprofit-based consortium that included partners like Johnson Controls, Alcoa, Google.org, and the Turner Foundation. Our flagship product, the first of several from a common platform, is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle which will go for up to 100 miles per gallon. This is a 5 times improvement over the best-in-class competitor in our class. Bright is on track to be in production at an annual rate of 50,000 vehicles per year by 2012, and to grow from there. As a new startup, Bright will ramp to scale and do it immediately. Our focus is on optimizing platform physics. Beyond just an advanced powertrain, it is a combination of lightweighting, best-in-class aerodynamics, low rolling resistance tires, sustainable materials, and that advanced electric powertrain that combine to provide truly breakthrough opportunities. To make the vehicle of the future, you can't begin with an existing or normal platform. Retrofitting and adaptation is only part of the solution. You need to begin from scratch and build from the ground up. This solves some of the economic and efficiency challenges that are presented by advanced batteries and technologies. Bright adopted a long-standing listen to the customer approach. We spoke to numerous vendors, drivers, program managers, users, and other customers of our vehicle across more than 20 states so that the customer, the user of our vehicle, helped us design our first program. We see the future of the auto industry as a smart electrified fleet that intelligently communicates with the grid, incorporates heavy renewable sources, and accelerates the decarbonization of 2 of the largest U.S. energy consumers, transportation and electrification/buildings. In order to increase efficiency of the U.S. vehicle fleet, industry needs to focus on new platforms and materials, develop and bring to scale batteries, motors, and power electronics, and prepare for the ecosystem of innovation. Bright's new vehicle platform does each of these things. The technologies available and necessary for this transformation are here. The path forward is merely one of implementation and execution. On December 19, 2007, 10 days short of a year ago, the President signed into law the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. This law recognized it was in the national interest to have a more efficient vehicle fleet. Congress, realizing that this presented enormous challenges to the industry, created Section 136 of that law, what you, Mr. Chairman, referred to as the Green Car Factory Fund. This advanced technology vehicle program is currently being—
When I say this, I get tired of people calling it 136, okay? It's what it is. It's the Green Factory, Fund, and if people would call it that, then the public would understand what the fight is over.
This loan program is being administered by the Department of Energy. The Green Car Factory Fund is cited in all of the plans of the Detroit 3 as a key component of funding their compliance with new efficiency regulations. Section 136 is a critical component of the transformation of the industry. It has the potential to be the catalyst for achieving positive change. As an example of that, Bright Automotive last week submitted our proposal for a loan under this fund. It is a critical component of the path forward for companies like us, as well as the big 3. And you've seen numerous applications under the program. In our nation, small business has a long-standing and proud tradition. It is the financial and economic backbone of this nation. It is also the incubator of new ideas, new challenges, and new industries. Bright Automotive is a small business, a startup company that accepts the challenges of the day. It's dedicated to the design and production of a new, cost-efficient, effective, next-generation vehicle that has the potential to revitalize the automobile industry, to serve our customers, and to put people to work, and in the process make our nation and our world a better, greener place. I appreciate your attention, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Mr. Munger. And by actually using that phrase, it shows your company gets it. They know what this is all about. Our next witness, Dr. Peter Markey, a professor of international business at the University of Maryland. Prior to joining the university, he served as Director of Economics at the U.S. International Trade Commission. He has years of experience overseeing the Trade Commission investigations and has provided useful guidance to Congress along the way. We thank you, Dr. Markey, for being here. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My university and I are deeply honored.
If you could please.
I think nah, okay.
Could you pull it in a little bit closer to you, if you could?
Okay.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My university and I are deeply honored that you've invited me here to testify before a committee with such an important mission and with such a distinguished panel. 3 weeks ago, I testified with the CEOs of the 3 largest automakers, and it's somewhat refreshing to be among people who talk about what can be done, not what can't be done. The automobile industry, despite its various warts, is central to the health of the U.S. economy. And it is central to any effort that we might have to accomplish reductions in greenhouse gases, to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, which is a very choking dependence, and to recover from the recession that now plagues the nation. The tailpipe offers among the greatest opportunities to reduce emissions and to also create a vital export industry because of all of the components that will go into the next generation of cars, which you call the 2.0 platform. Seemingly exotic forms of propulsion are about to become commonplace on the American highway. Within the next 10 years, we will see vehicles that people thought were very far away, very close at hand. I've driven the hydrogen vehicle at Ford. It's a remarkable contraption. It's very practical. Its basic problem is it costs too much to make. Hybrid vehicles are much closer, and they will prove to be plug-in hybrids that transition to all electrics and then hydrogens and so forth, and this is very good. The United States needs personal transportation. Our patterns of settlement and urbanization make mass transit impractical for most commuters, and even more impractical for non-commuting travel, which is a much larger component of day-to-day car use than we realize. We're going to have these new vehicles one way or the other. The question is whether the United States makes them, whether they're made here, and whether they're made by U.S. car companies or foreign companies, either here or abroad. The U.S. automobile industry has 2 components, the Detroit 3, which make almost 1/2 of the vehicles we use, and the transplants. Both are vital to the regions where they're domiciled. However, the Detroit 3, frankly, use many more components and embody more technology made in America and more high-quality jobs than when we buy vehicles from the transplants. So their future is important to us. I would say this to you, that right now, as they stand, they are not competitive. They claim they will be in 3 or 4 years. I do not believe that on the basis of what they have shown me. I don't believe that giving them a bailout will make them competitive, no matter how many conditions that we attach. The Congress is very good at writing laws. I don't know that it's very good at the proceedings of a bankruptcy court. And what these industries need to do, these companies need to do, is to go through Chapter 11, or at least have the threat of Chapter 11 with regard to their stakeholders to bring them into line to get the results that they need. They just have too much debt and a labor agreement that doesn't work, and frankly, management that just doesn't see the future clearly enough, although there's considerable variability among the Detroit 3 in that regard. My feeling is if you bail them out, they will politicize the process. They'll find some way around the restrictions on lawsuits and all that. They will find a way to lobby the system. If they don't do it, their union will do it for them. And we will end up, over time, with an industry that is still less cost competitive. And when we finally, after hundreds of billions of dollars, decide to cut them loose and go through Chapter 11, it will be a smaller industry than it is now, and we will save fewer jobs by reorganizing them. The sooner we give them the cure, the sooner the more jobs we will save. That said, there's a lot of things that the Congress could do to improve the competitiveness of making cars in North America and in the United States. For one thing, we could do something about currency manipulation, not just in Japan and Korea, but in China and other places where components are being made. We could have the clunker tax, the clunker subsidy that one of the members has mentioned. That is, when you trade in your clunker, you get a tax rebate of some kind. I would make it larger depending on the size of the vehicle and the age of the vehicle. If you bring me a brand new Tahoe, you get the biggest subsidy. If you bring us a 30-year-old Chevette, you get the smallest subsidy, as long as it goes through the crusher, so we never see it on the road again. Congress could provide substantial development assistance to U.S.-based automakers to make more fuel-efficient cars. I would provide this to all the automakers, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, the whole bunch, the battery makers, anybody who wants to be involved, under the condition that they share their patents with one another for reasonable fees, the Japanese model of the 70s and 80s. You get to participate in the development research, but if you get a new patent, you have to share it with your competitors for a reasonable fee, so we accelerate the development of these vehicles. The conditions for participating would be that you undertake your R&D here and you do your first round of production here, your full-scale mass production in the United States. These kinds of smart industrial policies, along with smart additions to the power grid, which are going to be absolutely necessary to plug in this gentleman's vehicles, I think could give us a fuel-efficient export industry for the future. I would suggest you would probably be run by very different people than are running it right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morisi, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Jeff.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, could you have my full statement put in the record?
Yeah, your full statement and the full statement of all of our witnesses will be included in the record. Our next witness is Mr. Jeff Wardell. Wardell? Wardle. Mr. Jeff Wardle, the Director of Advanced Mobility Research at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. The school is one of the world's leading automotive design schools and has produced the heads of design at BMW, Nissan, Ford, and other companies. Mr. Wardle has spent more than 25 years as a professional designer in the industry and as a design educator. Thank you for joining us, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about these issues right at a time when perhaps we're entering a new era of thinking about transportation and energy policy. And I think that future transportation and energy policy are inextricably entwined. I'd also like to point out I'm joined today by my colleague Dave Myers, who co-authored the written testimony that was circulated to you. Mr. Myers is the Vice President of Educational Initiatives at Art Center College of Design. We have similar but separate backgrounds as professional car designers and now educators, where we are focusing our passion, our design passion, on research and advocating future sustainable advanced mobility and transportation solutions. And so we would like to bring design and its creative processes and big picture systems thinking to these discussions on Detroit. In our written testimony, we make 4 major recommendations on how to deal with the rescue plan for General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. But we are here to confirm that the business model of the traditional American automobile industry is broken. The future of personal mobility is no longer just about cars. So insisting that the auto industry develops energy-efficient vehicles is by itself not an adequate prerequisite for financial assistance, in our opinion. I think it's fair to say, though, that the legacy auto industry does an exceptionally good job of designing, developing, and making vehicles that unfortunately people no longer really want. Meanwhile, there are startup companies like Tesla, Aptera, Bright Automotive represented here, and Fisker that are financially challenged to get products that Americans do need into manufacture and to market. So we would recommend using some of the bailout funds to deploy idle manufacturing capabilities of the legacy companies to enable the startups to get their already developed products to market sooner rather than later and on a meaningful scale. America's current transportation network is based on the Futurama vision that was showcased at the 1939 New York World Fair. We are now well overdue for a brand new Futurama vision, but a vision that does not rely on cheap energy, vast quantities of raw materials, destruction of natural habitats, and disregard for climate change, human safety, and quality of life. So we also recommend that some of the funding should go towards a far-reaching, nationwide smart and sustainable network of transportation systems. This will also provide much of the new business for an overhauled and revitalized Detroit, simultaneously providing a guaranteed customer for these new products that they would make. Finally, some of the money should go towards setting up a powerful independent commission that will define and develop policy for these sustainable transportation systems that America badly needs to replace its current outmoded model. We've referred to this independent commission in our written testimony as a think tank, but in retrospect we realize probably that's not the most appropriate term for what we have in mind. What we do have in mind is a multidisciplinary group of forward-thinking, transportation-minded specialists that should include engineers, transportation designers, sociologists, urban planners, scientists, architects, environmental designers, manufacturers, and economists who can bring a really broad insight into what our future transportation needs really are. This multidisciplinary group of forward-thinking, transportation-minded specialists would enable, as I say, great oversight into what our true transportation requirements are, and thus we would have a much clearer picture of the role that the automotive industry would play in that. The future role of designers in industry will also move just beyond designing new vehicles. Designers already understand that new transportation solutions are more about complete systems. We have to think about complete systems. Finally, I'd like to conclude by saying that we think that the debate nationally currently seems to revolve around a rescue plan for the next 100 days. We strongly feel that this discussion needs to be centered on the next 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Munger. Mr. Waddle, very much. Our final witness is Mr. Richard Curlis, the Chief Technological Officer at MAG Americas. His company is one of the largest component suppliers for the domestic auto industry, and he personally brings a lifetime of expertise in the machine tool industry to our hearing here today. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you. Chairman Markey, Congresswoman Miller, who asked me to testify here today, and members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for having me participate in this hearing. My company, MEG Industrial Automation Systems, is the largest machine tool company here in the United States. We are the only U.S. machine tool company remaining that has the technological breadth and skill sets to meet the equipment and process needs of our U.S. automotive companies. U.S. companies like MEG are critical to automotive, energy, aerospace, and other manufacturing industries. Automotive couldn't efficiently produce engines and transmissions without MEG processing technology and machinery. Today's equipment is nearly 300% more efficient and flexible than just 10 years ago. In aerospace, MEG has served as a pioneer in the supply of composite machines that are producing the airplanes of the future for major companies such as Boeing and Airbus, as well as many of their suppliers. MEG's machinery and process R&D is a critical enabler for supplying new technologies in manufacturing that will make companies more competitive, create jobs, and assure long-term success. Our high-end industries must implement lower-cost, efficient, long-term manufacturing solutions, and the solutions must be green. Our United States factories must be healthy and advanced in their performance. With the continuing rise of the world population and its use of energy, fossil fuels will continue to grow in scarcity. In order to combat the shortage in fuel, vehicles will have to be designed and produced that use alternate fuels and consume less energy. MEG wants to take our know-how and develop advanced solutions that will help the automotive industry manufacture these new fuel-efficient automobiles at much lower cost than they are able to do today. As best we can, our company tries to offer our manufacturing solutions to the automotive companies. However, it is difficult to work with them because they buy cheap parts from the Far East and often will source their equipment needs strictly on global price and not necessarily to get the best technology for the future. They must be cost competitive, but with short-sighted goals will spend money for the moment and not for the long run. Providing bailout money to the automotive industry is absolutely the right thing to do, but it must be done with strong conditions. The entire supply chain must be considered. R&D, parts, assemblies, and so on need to be part of a long-term solution involving American labor and know-how. Providing the funds and watching the funds go overseas is not an effective solution. Today, as an example, if you were to consider the flow of funds, for every $100 taken in by the automotive companies, $30 goes overseas for purchase of material. Equipment, R&D, other purchases add additional dollars going overseas. The automotive transplants coming to the United States are a great benefit to our economy, offering new assembly jobs. However, what about the supply of equipment and parts for these transplants? For Japanese transplants, these opportunities go straight back to Japan. For example, MEG receives no orders from these Japanese companies. On the other hand, MEG does very well working with some of the best automobile companies in the world, including companies out of Germany, France, and Korea, to name a few. Every country in the world is offering incentives to their technology provider companies and doing all possible to encourage collaboration. Grants and tax forgiveness are part of those countries' strategy to be sure their manufacturing base will be sustained and grow. The U.S. needs the same type government support programs to survive. The automobile industry is the place to start. Taxpayer funding must require, by means of incentives or guidelines, that the funds be used to buy U.S. technology. U.S. manufacturers and suppliers need to have access to low-interest project funding. Funding programs need to be available to these companies, serving as a catalyst to develop new manufacturing technologies and processes. And taxpayer funding to foreign transplants should require buy-in U.S. technology. The government's decision has a serious impact over the creation of transportation solutions for the future. Not investing in these technologies will cause the U.S. to jeopardize their superpower status and soon become dependent on foreign nations for the technology that defines one of our many freedoms, the automobile. The $25 billion in the Department of Energy Green Car Factory Fund is required for retooling. GM, Ford, and Chrysler and their suppliers will not be able to retool their factories without these funds. If the money is used for general cash flow issues, it must be replaced, or the alternate energy vehicle development will be severely compromised. The countries that can manage their energy needs will be superpowers of tomorrow. Companies with forward-thinking technologies such as lightweight CGI engines, carbon fiber body panels and powertrain components, carbon fiber hydrogen storage tanks, advanced high-throughput machining, and so on, will be the automobile companies of the future. Those that do not adapt fast enough will fail. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for having me speak here today and to share openly and honestly our company's views for addressing the proposed automotive bailout and what it could mean for more energy-efficient automobiles and other transportation vehicles. It is critical that whatever decisions are made will be to assure a long-term, sustainable, and growing economy for the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curlis, very much. Now we'll turn to questions from the committee, and the chair will recognize himself. Ms. Claybrook, what do you think about an idea of tying these loans to an interest rate for each one of the companies, depending upon how successful they are in moving to more efficient vehicles that are constructed? For example, if a company beats their efficiency requirement by 1 mile per gallon, they get a 1/4 point reduction in interest rate. Or if they are making 200,000 all-electric vehicles by a certain date, that they get a 1/2 point or a whole point taken off of their interest rate. What do you think about that as a positive incentive for companies to move in that direction?
I think it's a great idea. I just think that the fuel economy number that they have to meet has to be higher than what's in the law for 2007 before you would do that. So I hope that the bill will be amended to require a 25% increase over 2007, and that be the starting point.
What do you think of that, Mr. Munger? What do you think of this idea, Mr. Munger, of tying the interest rate to how successful they are, so that it's a positive incentive for them to exceed whatever the baseline is that we establish for them to meet?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's an interesting idea. An extension of that that I've been talking about with a few people is if you set a high enough baseline where there's actually a forgiveness of some of the loans, if you achieve a very high level of efficiency, in effect, you pay back the industry for some of the national savings in reducing oil consumption. So, the orders of magnitude when you spread it across the size of some of these fleets of doubling efficiency, could cause 100 million barrels of oil of foregone demand in a year, and that could pay back on, the order of magnitude, something similar.
Okay, Dr. Morisi, what do you think? Could you turn on the microphone, please?
First of all, you have to set it high enough.
No, we agree with that. Assuming that's the case,
Because
if they exceed that goal,
What I want to talk about what's high enough, and that is that they can't just accomplish it by tweaking the internal combustion engine, that they have to be using alternative platforms to get it done without specifically requiring it. There's so much that can be done just with the engines that they have. We don't want them to just retune them a bit and get some money back. We want them to start to earnestly make the transformation to hybrids and do it in a way that they get rewarded for it, and that's fine.
so that's what I said. If they make a
That's
quarter of a
possible.
million all-electric vehicles, then they get per year, then they get a...
Figuring out what the number should be.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. You like that concept, though?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Mr. Waddle.
Yes, I think that we all respond positively to incentives. The trick will be to make sure that the numbers are right. And I'd also like to point out that in the long term, it's not just fuel efficiency or energy efficiency that we have to address. We have to address other issues of sustainable industrial activity, and I think those same incentives should be applied to that as well.
Okay, Mr. Curlis.
Yes, I agree. Milestones need to be established, and the amounts that we talk about need to be considered along with those milestones.
Mr. Munger, you have testified that your intention is to produce 50,000 of your electric vehicles by the year 2012. General Motors is touting the fact that they're going to build 10,000 volts in 2010 and maybe 50 to 70,000 in 2011. How can Bright Motors be on the same exact track almost as General Motors, and you don't even have a factory yet? How can you be so bold as to make such a statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the key that Bright has done a very thorough analysis of figuring out two things. One, really understanding what our customer is interested in, and two, by focusing on the total vehicle platform, we've achieved a cost level that is much more attractive than what news reports suggest around the Volt. So
As you look at General Motors and their Volt, does that send a chill up your spine, the schedule they're setting for the Volt in terms of your vehicle's competitiveness when they get going?
We're not going to be directly competitive with the Volt, so we're in a slightly different segment. However,
what segment are you in, Mr.?
We're tackling a larger format of vehicle, so what would currently be called a light truck. So that includes
what would currently be called a
light truck, so a category that includes SUVs and minivans. So instead of a passenger car, there's actually a lot of opportunity to gain efficiency in those larger vehicles.
Okay. Is there, Mr. Waddle, a company that is going to directly compete with the Volt that you know of, that we should have some confidence will be there in the marketplace in 2010, 11, and 12?
I suspect that there is competition from overseas companies which will be very close to the Volt. I think it's worth pointing out that some of the startup companies have products that I think would be extremely competitive with the Volt if they can get them into production soon enough.
Okay. Dr. Morisi.
Both Toyota and Ford have plug-in hybrids in the pipeline as well. It's the same concept.
Dr. Morisi, you don't seem very optimistic about the big three in the long run. Do you really believe that any amount of money that we can give to them is going to be sufficient to allow them to be competitive in the long run? Right now, General Motors only has 85,000 hourly workers. How many hourly workers, using your analysis do you think they'll have in 3 years?
Oh, I don't have that number, but I know that it will continually decline even if they are productive, even if they become competitive, because it requires fewer hourly workers to make an automobile each year. It's an inexorable process. It's like your personal computer. My feeling is that the technology is there to be competitive, and the products are in the pipeline there to be competitive. If you look at Ford and you ask them, well, why didn't you have these products 2 years sooner? If you look at their plan, and they have a very good answer, is that they have a very different management team than they had 3 or 4 years ago. And the management team they had 3 or 4 years ago very much looks like the management team that General Motors and Chrysler has right now, wedded to the SUV and the truck and all the rest of that. But my feeling is the technology is there. If you could take them through the Chapter 11 process and shake them down and shake them out and restructure their debt and all the rest, that they could get it done. And I don't think the Congress can simulate that, and I think Rick Wagner's scare tactics are unfortunate, but I think it's possible to do.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Munger, if the Green Car Factory Fund is empty or closed to you and your company and companies like your company, how would that affect your timeline and overall viability?
It would certainly delay our process. We were pursuing a pretty aggressive and attractive private capital path. The credit disruptions that have hit everyone, you know, we're having struggles around that, just like all of the other innovative companies that have been referenced here today. So the Green Car Factory Fund is an accelerator. You know, the amount of money required to push quickly certainly get enabled by that fund to get things done faster.
Okay, and Mr. Curlis, could you answer that question in terms of how you think it affects the competitors to the big three?
Well, I think it's definitely a requirement because capital is very difficult to come by, and these loans are going to be really critical for just not the big three, but the others as well.
If the others can't have access to that money,
then it's going to create a difficult situation for them, that's for sure.
And how many companies do you think that would affect?
Oh, maybe 4 or 5.
4 or 5 companies.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that could ultimately represent 100,000 new jobs in a relatively brief period of time, huh?
Correct.
When you're making 50,000 of these vehicles, sir, how many employees do you anticipate that you'll have?
We'd have a direct employee base of about 1,000 employees between the factory and the headquarters and development staff, and then because it's a largely outsourced model for a number of your supply partners, that's probably another 2,000 employees working on the body or the engine or, you know, various components of the vehicle.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. Munger. In this bailout plan, as far as you've seen it, is there any benefits to your organization at all, the one that's being proposed?
As far as I have seen on the draft legislation that came out last night, there isn't anything. You know, I think that particularly, you know, the money that is in the Green Factory Fund needs to be returned to it. It would be really beneficial, I think, to the smaller companies to make it clear that, you know, the legislation already reads that there's an opportunity for them to apply, but if the Congress found it in their wisdom to actually create a set-aside for those small companies, that would be very beneficial.
Right. By the way, I'd love to yield to Mrs. Miller if she's prepared. That's fine, thank you. So if we deplete the Green Car Factory Fund and send it to those who are in this dire financial strait and not assist you, who have what many of us hope to be a very viable product, how would we defend that? It's a rhetorical question, but
I'm interested in how you will, sir.
So is there a proposal, and should we consider a proposal to accelerate some assistance to the what we'll say the little guys in the race, yourself included with Tesla and some of the other companies have been mentioned? Has that group, the little guys in the race, have they made any proposal that they should be part of this tranche, if you will, that's going out the door in the next 30 days?
I don't believe a proposal around that has been made, but I think there have been proposals to create that allocation to small companies and to encourage the Department of Energy to act quickly. If there are funds in the program, they could allocate loans immediately.
Given the relatively small scale, it seemed to me that would be doable, would it not? I mean, you're talking about small percentages of the amounts that would go to the big three that would have still a large impact with your capital needs in the next 6 months, would it not?
Yes, it would. 10 or 20% would certainly fund 5 to 10 Brights.
So is this group making any proposal in this regard?
We will pursue that.
Well, I mean, to me, I mean, you look at, there's the Chevy Volt, there's the Bright product, there's Tesla, there's several others. There's a guy in Bainbridge Island making an all-electric car named Bob Frake, who's a neighbor of mine, lives 2 miles from where I am, okay? Why isn't he involved, have some option to get capital from the federal government? He's paying his taxes too, frankly, and I think your options for success may be as great as the big threes. So to me, it's a little troublesome to take care of only the larger players here when we know that, innovation can come from 2 bike, makers in Dayton, Ohio, who built the first airplane. I mean, I have to tell you, that troubles me. And I would encourage you to at least think in those terms. I actually talked to Tesla last week about some ideas in this regard, because I think America wants to go forward here. And we want to take care of the employees of these existing companies, but we want to see growth as well. Anyway, I just encourage you. I think it's worth thinking about. Ms. Claybrook, can I ask you about the idea of increased requirements for increased mileage for access of this? What do you do about the argument of the big three that if we had an increased mileage condition to get these receipts of these funds, that would put them at a competitive disadvantage, and they're already in a weakened position? And is a response to simply increase the mileage standards for everyone, whether you take the money or not?
Well, of course, we would love to see that. We have urged increased fuel economy requirements for a long time. In this bill, though, I think that the plans that the manufacturers submitted, which do show an increased capacity for fuel economy, should be mandated. Their plans should not just be their plans, but they could change. They get the money today and they change their plans tomorrow. So that's the first and foremost, most important thing. And so we would certainly like to see the increase, for everybody, but it's not going to put them at a competitive disadvantage, because they are now at a competitive disadvantage because they have not invested in technology and innovation, and they have taken the cash cow SUV and used all the money, and they still have a debt at General Motors of $66 billion. So they need to have products that people want to buy. That's what we've been talking about today. And so I think that it only helps them to have these tough requirements, because they don't want to miss the bet here, and they are scared to death, and they should be, that they are not going to be a manufacturer 2 years from now. So to say, okay, you got to make this a priority, I would put safety in that number as well, because they've been fighting the same kinds of safety requirements for roof crush and rollover and children, protecting children, and side head impact and other things. Just the other day, the Department of Transportation delayed the implementation of a standard that was issued a couple of years ago on side impact protection. So when they're redesigning these vehicles, they should do the whole job as one piece. And when I was its administrator, we designed an experimental safety vehicle. And it met, this is in 1977, it met the 1985 fuel economy standards, and they were tough. And it also had improved safety. When you redesign a vehicle, you should do the whole thing at once. So I believe that, that this will only help the manufacturers, not hurt them. And I would be happy to see those standards adopted for all cars, all vehicles.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Millett, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And, we feel a little defensive being from Michigan. I can't even get my microphone to work. I guess that's sort of indicative here. But we feel a little defensive, obviously, in Michigan. And we look at what has happened with the bailouts, the $700 billion TARP bailout. And I will also say, for the record, we feel that it would have been optimal to have any loans for the domestic auto industry coming out of that original bailout funds, rather than coming out of the Green Car Factory Fund, which I also agree Section 136 is not very descriptive of it. Unfortunately, the optimal was not possible, and as we look at this now, and I will also say, we feel as though there has been a double standard. I recognize that there have been mistakes made. However, we on the Hill here, you have the domestic auto industry that is almost in a capacity of abject groveling, it seems like to us. And that's why I went through my litany of some of the historical significance of this industry to our nation, and why I think it is so important, and why we want to be a critical component of our nation going forward in every way. But perhaps the big three shouldn't have, wasn't a very good PR move to be flying here on their corporate jets. The good thing for the guys from Wall Street that got all those the money, they never had to come to Washington to ask for the money. You know those guys that helicopter in from the Hamptons every day? No, they didn't even have to come here and ask for any money because it was hand-delivered to them. And I hear people saying, Wagner's got to resign and so on and so forth. I don't hear anybody talking about the president of Citigroup that got in the neighborhood of $40 billion so far, I think, that maybe he ought to resign. There's no talk of any of that. And I also think that in some ways, because of what has happened here in our nation and the response of Congress with the bailouts, et cetera, that the industry, the domestic auto industry, has gotten caught up a bit in bailout fatigue that is very apparent here on the Hill. But at any rate, I think this, hopefully there is a deal that, in a compromise that has been agreed to. We hope that there's going to be enough votes. I think you are going to see a restructuring, and I think the country is going to have a high degree of confidence as we go forward that we have gotten the message, and things are going to change, and all the stakeholders are going to do what we need to do to make this a competitive industry. I guess my first question would be for Mr. Munger, and you mentioned that your company had actually submitted a proposal for some funds. Could you flesh that out a bit for me? I'm just curious, if you could. How much did you apply for, and how would you utilize those funds? I believe the batteries that you're using right now are made in China, and I only mention that because we see all of these other countries that have an auto industry are bailing out or loaning money to their industry. It was mentioned about the lithium-ion batteries. I think last year the nation of Japan spent over $1 billion on R&D for lithium-ion batteries, not just for their vehicles, but for their electronics, et cetera. And in our country, we've expected the auto industry to do all of this themselves. But how would you actually spend some of the money out of that fund?
Certainly, thank you for the question. We've applied for a $450 million loan under the Department of Energy loan program. Those funds are as purposed for OEMs to finalize vehicle engineering and fund, sort of engineering validation work, as well as pay for tooling and construction of our facility. And to your question regarding the battery, we actually are discussing options with multiple battery suppliers. And
in America?
We have encouraged some of the people we're talking to actually apply under that program to make sure that they get a facility built here in America. Unfortunately, Section 135, which is a battery-focused fund, wasn't funded. But the battery companies that have worked here in the United States are focused on Section 136 as component suppliers to vehicles to try to get their facilities built here in America. I think the congressman from Washington made a good point that we don't want to transition our dependence on foreign oil to foreign batteries. And Bright Automotive is open to economically buying from domestic suppliers.
Okay. Dr. Morisi, as an economist, let me just follow up a little bit on this, on the concept of whether or not any of the big three would go through bankruptcy, whether that be Chapter 11 or Chapter 7 or liquidation that may follow with some of those kinds of things, and what the cost actually would be to the nation for such a thing. We feel as though bankruptcy is a bit different I have no problem getting on an airline that is declared bankruptcy, is in the process of reorganization, et cetera. However, I may have a different concept of purchasing a $40,000 vehicle from a company that maybe is in bankruptcy or close to bankruptcy. If I have consternation about warranty and service work and all these kinds of things, we think it is a bit of a different animal. But we've had economists that have theorized that the cost to the country of bankruptcy could be as much as 4 times what we're talking about here for loans. When you think about unemployment costs, when you think about the cost to the PGBC, some of these kinds of things. And I guess my question would be, as an economist, have you looked at any other previous situation? Is there any analogy that we could use with some historical benchmarks of a an industry like this where there's been governmental intervention, now all of this oversight, everybody is an expert on the industry now, and I mean, I know there's got to be changes made, but there are all of these various things, and how did it work out? And how do you think this is going to work out?
Well,
Sir.
I wonder whether you've answered your own question to some degree. When we talk about bankruptcy, it could be many different concepts. A prepackaged Chapter 11 would ensure that suppliers are paid so that there wouldn't be that breakdown, so the industry essentially wouldn't shut down. The transplants by themselves cannot produce enough vehicles to satisfy U.S. demand, even at 10 million vehicles a year. So these factories are not going to go out of existence. They're going to be used. The question is who uses them and how. In Chapter 7, the factories are worth much less to the existing creditors than if they continue in production. So the logical sources of credit for a Chapter 11 debtor-in-possession bankruptcy are the existing banks who've already received considerable largesse from the U.S. government and could likely finance it. After all, we've given them $8 trillion in loan guarantees when the problem was caused by $2 trillion worth of collateralized debt obligations, and I'm still trying to find the other $6 trillion. In terms of governments becoming so heavily involved in the management of industries, we, to my knowledge, don't have peacetime analogs. However, I would ask you to look at the experience they had in Britain and France with nationalized industries of various kinds in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and ended in tears. Essentially, if you try to manage an industry with all of those experts involved, you become involved in management by committee, and you don't get a good outcome. I'm not in favor of shuttering the industry. After I testified, I called up Ford and said, no reasonable person wants you guys to shut down. However, the question is not whether we reorganize them, but how do we reorganize them to ensure that we get the outcomes that we need. I think there's a very grave danger. I think of what was suggested here this morning. If we impose mileage requirements on the Detroit 3 that are not imposed on the Japanese, and the price of gasoline falls to $1.50 a gallon and stays there, we put them at a competitive disadvantage. So we have to apply it to everybody. That may or may not be politically possible, but it's one example of the kinds of complications that we could become engaged in. And there's the other issue of the politicization. You asked a very interesting rhetorical question. Why is no one calling for John Thane's ouster this morning? I would suggest you might ask serious questions about campaign contributions and things of that nature for the committees involved in overseeing them. I know that is, I don't want to cross the line in becoming impolite, but I find it remarkable that members of the United States Congress called for Rick Wagner's resignation, and I have not been known to be a big fan of Rick Wagner, but they would call for his resignation after he asks for $12 billion, and Merrill Lynch has gotten how many hundreds, and there's John Thane arguing yesterday in front of his board for $10 million subsidies. I'd suggest that the easiest way to solve this problem is for Ford to make itself a bank, take some deposits, pay themselves too much money, and go over to the Senate Banking Committee and ask for help.
Thank you. I know my time has expired, and I appreciate the chair's indulgence.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Morisi, well, first of all, let me associate my comments, myself with the comments of the gentlelady from Michigan. I do think that we have double standard. I mean, I do think the people who go to work with lunch buckets are not receiving the kind of respect as the people who drive to Broad Street in New York City. But to go back to Chapter 11, the issue that I'm concerned about, as I believe the gentlelady was, just the stigma of Chapter 11, no matter what other components are put in place, I think will do damage to the whichever of the big three, whether it's Ford and GM and Chrysler or not. People are going to back away from those automobiles. Don't you think that's? I mean, we're backing away from them already.
If we repeat it over and over again, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If Rick Wagner tells everybody they shouldn't buy his own cars, and you tell them they shouldn't buy his own cars because there's a stigma, then they won't. Please hear what I'm saying. The country cannot get along with those factories closed. We cannot produce enough vehicles. So if they are in Chapter 11 reorganization with debtor-in-possession financing and the suppliers are being paid, there is reasonable expectation established that they will continue in operation. Not only that, we can provide third-party warranties. When you go down to Circuit City this Christmas season and buy a stereo or whatever it is that you want for your kids, and you buy a store warranty, it's not being guaranteed by Circuit City, it's being guaranteed by a third party. These warranties can be insured. And if we explain that to people, then that will change the psychology. But Rick Wagner saying that Chapter 11 is not possible, even though his board says he should consider it, and running around the country saying, my warranties will be no good if I'm in Chapter 11, creates that environment. So, you know, I guess what I'm getting back to, the real question is, how do we do this? Because they're going to have to be reorganized. So the question is, how do we do this? And I would suggest that the bankruptcy courts have a comparative advantage in imposing the conditions that are necessary to get us from here to there. That the Congress is very good at many things, but running a car company is not. And the lessons of Europe, when they tried to run car companies and steel companies and coal companies, is it didn't work out very well there either.
So would you support the car czar, which is apparently the direction we're going?
If you're going to give them the money, how could I not support the oversight? What I'm suggesting is it is not prudent to give them the money based on what they have said to you so far. You give them this first $15 billion, and you better draw 2 new lines on the budget right above HUD for Ford and General Motors, because they're going to be back year after year looking for money. They are not competitive now, and they will not become competitive if you give them that cash. You cannot spend $1.25, spend $1.25 on lemons, sugar, and water and sell lemonade for $1 a glass and make money. And that's what they're trying to do right now. The costs are simply too high.
Now, do all of you agree that the Big Three will attempt to avoid complying with the letter of the law that's in the language that will be considered later this week, hopefully? I mean, do all of you believe that they will do everything in their power, in spite of agreeing now, but at a later date will begin to try to backtrack?
Well, I use the term promises in terms of fuel economy and other things. I have seen auto industry plans come before the Congress and before the regulatory agency with promises, and when it wasn't locked into either law or regulation, they changed their mind. I think that the situation today is somewhat different because their life is on the line now, and they know that. And it's not just this year, it's this year and next year and the next 5 to 10 years. And also they know that there's going to be extreme oversight of how they spend that money and what product they produce. So I think it's more likely that they're going to do everything that they can and to comply. But I still think that they ought to have the clarity about what it is that they're supposed to do in terms of meeting fuel economy. And that's why I think it ought to be in the law. But I don't think that they're going to set about to undermine this. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if after the money is granted, which I believe it will be now, that Rick Wagner will step down and there will be somebody else there, so that this issue about the leadership will change. And the other 2 companies, well, particularly Ford, does have younger and more innovative management now than they've had in the past. So whether or not we tell them to change, the government tells them to change, I don't think that that's a good idea. But I think that if there's a concern about a particular manager, there ought to be negotiations and expressions of concern.
Well, I think all 3 of them are troglodytic in their management style.
Right.
But my question, I guess, is if this is a unique moment, which I think all of us would agree, then why not go all the way? Why not, would all of you agree to raise the CAFE standards in the legislation? I mean, if
it applies to everyone, sir.
I'm sorry?
If it applies to everyone, not just them.
Yes.
But I would also say to you, we've had other unique moments in history. For example, when they had the Asian currency bailout, we imposed all kinds of conditions on Thailand and Korea and all this. But after they got their money and got healthy again, they went on their merry way and manipulated their currencies. I would suggest to you that you can get all the promises you want out of General Motors, but you're dealing with an enormous entity with an enormous cultural resistance to change. and that you're going to have a lot of trouble writing it all down. I know you have the best of intentions, I really do, but I just don't think you can change General Motors from here. And if you give them the cash, they'll do what they have to get it from you, and you'll find they'll be back over and over again. This is going to cost you hundreds of billions of dollars. Get ready for it.
I would just like to disagree and say that when the fuel economy standards were issued in 1977, that these companies made major changes, and they knew they had to, or they were going to pay huge penalties. So another issue is that there are very significant penalties in the law if they don't meet these higher fuel economy standards, in addition to everything else that's in this legislation.
Of course, the only thing we could do is probably...
And they did, General Motors did a major change in their fuel economy. They doubled their fuel economy, and from 1977 to 1985, they doubled the fuel economy of their vehicles. Now, they started with a low number, but there's still lots of opportunities for innovation here, and there are some fabulous engineers in this industry. And I do agree that the management needs to change, but I think that there's capacity to do it. And
one final question, though. I mean, I agree with that we need strong penalty provisions in the law. The problem is you can't penalize people who are broke. I mean, unless, can we put their, pass legislation to put, put
it's already in the law. It's already in the law.
Joan, just
no.
Something in the law doesn't mean someone's going to do it. If you have a financial penalty and they have no money to pay, you can't get money from a man with empty pockets. If they're going to go out of business, if you don't give them the cash and you say, well, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, or I'll take the cash away, they're coming here to make up the difference between what their revenues and their costs are.
Well, the only thing we could...
You're right. It doesn't make sense.
But I think that you have to argue, has been argued here, that it's going to really hurt the purchasing of these vehicles if they go into bankruptcy.
Well, the only thing that would probably trouble them is we say, if you violate the letter of the law in this legislation, you'll have to play football for the Detroit Lions. I mean, that would probably be the worst thing we could do. They're broke. I mean, there's nothing else to do. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and there was nothing personal there, Ms. Miller. But the Patriots are hurting this year too. We're struggling with the loss of a quarterback. Without good leadership, it's difficult to make it to the Super Bowl. The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to reiterate that I think this is a great opportunity for us as a nation to look at our transportation system and start planning how we can make it better for the next century. Now, is Detroit capable of participating in this change? That's the question that's in front of us. I like to think that it is, and I hope that we can find a way to make that happen. But it's not a given in my mind by any means. They have this culture that we've talked about. But on the other hand, we have a big stick here, so I think we have an opportunity to do what's needed. Your inputs have been appreciated. I'm kind of intrigued by your technology, Mr. Munger. Could you tell me a little bit about what you mean when you say 100 miles per gallon? Is that sort of a hard figure, or is that sort of a squishy plug-in figure?
You've highlighted one of the issues around electrification. You have a choice in deciding what kind of propulsion you want. You can have an internal combustion gas-fueled engine, you can have a pure electric vehicle, or you can have a plug-in hybrid. And the issue is one of range, and a pure electric has range constraints. So when you run out of battery, you need to find a place to recharge it. To solve that, we've proceeded with a plug-in hybrid because the cheapest way to get range is actually through an internal combustion engine. Because the average vehicle drives 40 miles or less a day, we tried to optimize with the minimum amount of battery to achieve the most efficiency. We have a 30-mile pure electric range, and then the vehicle proceeds to drive in hybrid mode and would be about 40 miles per gallon. So on a 50-mile day, as an example, you would use a half a gallon of gas, getting to that 100-mile-per-gallon number. That's a calculation that is similar to what GM's been using around the Volt, and
so there's a standard way to make that calculation?
The industry is working towards it, yes.
Okay. What's the limitation in terms of you getting to where you need to be by 2014 or 2012? The number the year that you gave for the production of your vehicle?
The primary limitation for us moving forward is capital.
Capital.
The availability of funds for a $550 million program.
So the battery technology is not a limitation in your mind?
We have a very deep team in battery technology. John Waters behind me was one of the first builders of a plant to provide lithium-ion batteries to the transportation sector in North America. They sold lithium-ion batteries into the Segway program out of Delphi. He's been an executive in the industry, so we're pretty well aware of what batteries are able to do. We do also have a fallback to be able to provide a nickel-cadmium solution.
Sure, Dr. Marisi.
I don't know these guys. I never met them before. But 3 years ago, I worked on a project for the Defense Department concerning, alternative vehicle technologies, and I went through the Rocky Mountain Institute stuff and all the rest. The difference between this man and Rick Wagner is no one told him he can't do it. You're looking at the future if you let him happen.
Not bad, not bad.
It's all there, sir. It's all there. This guy is real.
Then what you should do is send a note to the Department of Energy and ask them to hurry up.
Exactly. Get the money to this man as quick as you can.
Well, we don't want to go that far in promoting a business, but I certainly want to encourage new innovation. And one of the things that the gentleman from Washington raised, the question is, are we going to be dependent on batteries from overseas? And that's where we don't want to go either. So do you have a comment on that?
I think there are battery technologies here in the U.S. that are working to build facilities. They have a similar constraint. There's a chicken and the egg problem in the industry where capital providers want to see them on a program, and program developers want them to have a facility. I think you should speak to some of the people that were involved in GM's process. I believe they're going to be applying for Section 136 funds, and
Green car factory.
yes, well, maybe we should submit for the record that we change the name of that program to the Green Car Factory Fund. But there are efforts underway to get that capacity and technology here into the U.S. People realize that building them here is important.
One other question. In what ways did the future of the auto industry require the resources of the big three? So you're proposing that you ramp up production and so on. What do we need from the big three if we were to move towards smaller businesses? I mean, there must be some part of that infrastructure that's needed to carry out the transportation needs of our country.
Well, in our specific case, we've been working actually and talking to all three of the Detroit three. We have an interest in procuring some of the parts that they use. We've talked to them about buying efficient engines. We're not trying to innovate with a new internal combustion engine. They buy and build lots of them. They have excess capacity in some of their parts. And so we've found them to be very productive partners in some of those dialogues. I think you have to recognize that they do have really good engineers, really good designers. There's a lot of skill set within those companies that's critically important to the industry as a whole. I don't want to get into what the structure of deploying those resources should be, but I don't think we should lose sight of the amount of capacity, knowledge, and understanding that exists within those companies, because they are important in that light.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you,
Ms.
Mr.
Solis.
Chairman. Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here to hear this discussion with all of you having your various opinions. And I represent a very interesting part of the state in California, Southern California, which is just a catastrophe right now in terms of air pollution and congestion. And we desperately need help in terms of our fleet vehicles. And I want to just pose a question. No one here has talked about the infrastructure. In California right now, we have an initiative by our governor, Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who says he wants us to turn to fuel-efficient vehicles, but we don't have enough stations there to provide that capacity. There hasn't been enough monies made available to allow for these sorts of traditional stations that need to be set up in appropriate places. So it's beyond me that we can talk about new cars and what have you, but if we don't have an infrastructure that's ready, available, and willing to make themselves available and accessible to our public, then what incentive is there for people in Los Angeles to move in that direction. That's one question. The other one, I represent a very poor working class district, and auto parts resonates with me in terms of where people have to get their parts. I hear that a lot. They have to go overseas, and then the reliability of those parts is not very good. They're not very efficient. They break down. You have to spend more money. I would hope that we can somehow begin to address that portion, that we begin to refocus our energies and maybe look at how we can develop those parts here and keep those jobs here. And then the green collar jobs aspect of it all. I know in South Central Los Angeles there was an experiment that's still going on with Toyota. Toyota wasn't told by the federal government to come in and help train workers. They did it on their own, and I think they put in maybe a couple of million, $7 million, I think, to help restart and provide free training for individuals in low-income, depressed areas. The Green Collar Job Act was really an idea also to try to get people into these new industries, not just in putting pieces together, but also learning the technology. I've not heard anything from the big three about reinventing themselves in that manner, because that's where I think the market has focused on in the last few years. I know they target the Latino community very heavily, the big three, in terms of their SUVs and their pickups. Now we need to change that kind of behavior amongst our community as well. Toyota's done a great job. They do advertising. They do all kinds of things. They give incentives. They do charitable work. I don't know that the big three have done enough to really include communities of color. So those are my issues, and I'll let you speak. And Mr. Munger, one question for you though: if the 50,000 cars that you're going to develop, what is the price? What is the unit price for one car? Just right off the top.
We've been talking to our customers about a price in the high 40,000s. In the high 40,000s, and they would save over $5,000 a year in fuel cost.
That's still relatively high for an average community like mine, where the gross their annual salaries range from 20 to 30,000. So that's not affordable for people that I represent.
Let me comment on that too about volumes. We've been hearing about the 50,000, and that's wonderful. And what's going to happen is we need the big three to handle volume, and we need their understanding of manufacturing and technology to get to this volume, because we're talking about millions of cars here, folks, millions of cars, not 100,000. So when we talk about, for example, looking at automation, just to automate a factory, we don't even want to start looking at it until we're talking about 100,000 parts. And more typically, I hear about 800,000 parts. This is the kind of volumes that we're talking about to be affordable. And if we keep trying to buy this overseas, what do you think the foreign companies that are automobile companies sitting right next to those parts makers are doing? They're getting those parts at a lot less price than we're going to pay here in the United States. So we need to bring it here to the United States, and we got to use our technology for volumes and for automation and for production.
I just want to jump back on the pricing point a little bit, because I think that the question isn't, very few of the people you're referring to and customers globally actually buy a car in a single lump sum. And so what we're talking about is actually a transition of paying a high fixed, a high price for your gasoline and a lease payment for a fixed price, more or less, that's actually lower on a combined basis. So there's an education process that needs to take place to help people understand what it means to buy these vehicles, because you're essentially paying for your gasoline up front. And there are policies that, we've gotten pretty clear confidence from our customers that they will pay that price, because we do have a different demographic target. But also, it's really important that, things like fee-bates that transition or charge a fee for inefficient vehicles and provide a rebate for the most efficient vehicles can help bridge that gap to the consumer to understand that it's actually an NPV positive calculation. So they save money over the time they own the vehicle, but it's hard for consumers to understand that.
Is that mostly for commercial, though?
He's not selling
We are
compact
commercial,
cars, though. He's selling a much larger commercial vehicle.
Right.
So we're not pricing a $45,000 vehicle against a Mazda 3 or a Ford Focus. We're pricing it against a much larger vehicle. The other thing to remember is that when the Tandy personal computer first came out, Radio Shack cost about $8,000. You have to have an opportunity to go down the commercialization curve of this technology. If we can start making them, then we will make them cheaper. So, you know, some patience is required. The automobile started out being a vehicle for the very wealthy or a commercial vehicle, and then it got commercialized. Well, the same thing will happen here. As for parts factories that your constituents might work in, or people they compete with might work in, the single most significant thing this body could do to assist them would be to fix the Chinese currency problem. That is what's moving all these factories over there. It creates a 50%, 45% subsidy on Chinese exports to this country. What's more, in order to sell cars in China, you have to make them there, and then they make you move your parts factories there. That's what we have to fix. We don't have a free trade policy with China. We have a dumb trade policy. That has to be fixed, or none of this can be fixed.
I would quickly like to respond, if I may, to your 3 questions about infrastructure, spare parts, and green-collar training. I'd like to remind the committee that when the Model T Ford was introduced in 1908, there were no filling stations. You had to buy your gasoline at a pharmacy. And so I think it's a chicken and egg situation. As these new kinds of vehicles do come into the market, the infrastructure to support them will follow. When it comes to spare parts, a lot of these new generations of vehicles, which are predominantly electric drive, will require less spare parts. Electric motors and the drivetrains associated with them are a lot less complicated, a lot more reliable than the traditional internal combustion engine. So your constituents in a few years' time won't be looking for spare water pumps and all of the other things that typically go wrong with older cars. And also at the beginning of my career, when it comes to green collar training, you talked about how Toyota have been training and been good stewards. At the beginning of my career, I watched the British car industry crumble as the Japanese car manufacturers moved into Great Britain, and I saw a sea change in management attitudes as these companies came in. They took far more care to make sure that their new, often green in another sense of the word, vehicle workers, factory workers were trained properly, and it brought a completely different dynamic. So it's very, very important that the industry takes care of training its workforces.
The gentlelady's time has expired. We just have a few members here. I'm going to, as a result, recognize members for a second round of questions. This is a very important, actually an historic panel in terms of what this discussion represents, in terms of what our expectations should be for $15 billion, $34 billion, or, as Dr. Marisi is saying, an infinity sign next to the amount of money which the automotive industry is going to request from us. Excuse me? It's very big. A big, big number. So let me go down and ask each of you this question. In testimony last week, Mr. Mullally at Ford and Mr. Wagoner at General Motors submitted plans to the Congress. Here's what the plan said. For Ford, they said that they would make a 26% fleet improvement by 2012. They would make a 36% improvement in their fleet by 2015. Here's what Mr. Wagoner said that General Motors would do for the money, that they would average 37.3 miles per gallon in their cars by 2012 and 27.5 miles per gallon for their trucks by 2012. Now, some very smart people at the Natural Resources Defense Council translated these standards into grams of CO2 per mile. When they did that, they found that these plans actually meet the California standard, which is being debated over whether or not there should be a waiver for California to impose these standards. So that actually translates into an equivalent of 36 miles per gallon by 2015. So the question is, going back to Ms. Claybrook, if they're testifying to the effect that they can meet that standard and they want money from us, And that's what their promise is to us, even if, as Dr. Morisi or others might say, they might try to wiggle out of it. Doesn't it make sense to put their promises technologically into the law as the condition of getting the money, so that at least Ms. Clayburgh and others can sue them, the NRDC, the Sierra Club, and others, if they don't meet that standard, so that they know that there will be some accountability. Let's go down quickly and have each one of you answer that question. President Bush is saying he really doesn't want to go in that direction, but we're going to have a big debate about this in the next 24 hours. That is the question of whether or not we should have these conditions or some type of conditions attached in terms of what the goals should be of these industries from a mandated perspective, given the fact that they're saying that they can meet these standards. Ms. Clayburgh.
They should be in the law.
They should be in the law. Mr. Munger.
In the law,
in the law, in the law, not in the law.
In the law for all companies.
In the law for all companies. Good. In the law.
In the law for all companies.
In the law for all companies. Dr. Morisi.
For all companies, including the transplants.
Including the.
Make sure that all means including the transplants.
Transplants means.
The Japanese car manufacturers who operate here, the Germans, the Koreans, all those people that make cars here.
Okay, good. Mr. Wardle.
I think that, yes, that they should be included in the law. However, I think that the standards that, the figures that you have just described are woefully unimaginative for the future. There are companies already that can deliver cars with that corporate average.
Mr. Wardle, you and Ms. Clayburgh have already made this point, and that's why we have you testify. You are idealists who are testifying. But President Kennedy said to people who looked like me when I was 14 years old that our job in politics was to be idealists without illusions. And that's what that 15-foot gap between the witness table and those of us who are sitting up there represents. And so we try to do the best we can, given the incredible political opposition that is presented by very powerful institutions, including someone who sits in the Oval Office of the United States of America right now. So I agree with your vision. I thank you for it, and I thank Ms. Clayburgh. We're trying here to take advantage of a political opportunity as idealists without illusions. And so, yes, I would do more myself if I could, wearing my idealist cap, but I don't have that luxury right now. I have to try to figure out what we might be able to get done in the next 24 hours or the next 24 days or so when we come back and revisit the issue. Mr. Curlis.
Yes, you need to put performance measures in. Absolutely.
And would you take the performance measures that the industry
Absolutely. That's the way to do it. Now, you may want to go back and double check them one more time, but it should be there. And technologically speaking, they're going to be able to do this. It's a question of just exactly what vehicles they're talking about and how the mix looks. But in the end, they can achieve this, and those measures need to be in the law.
Right. So,
Mr. Chairman,
yes,
okay,
Ms. Clayburgh.
so that's through 2015, but the existing standards go through 2020. So what are you going to do now? The existing standards through 2020 are 35 mpg. They say 36 by 2015. So what are you going to do between 2015 and 2020 in the law?
I agree with you, Ms. Clayburgh. We'll try to figure that out. But as President Kennedy used to say, the fact that we can't make progress on all fronts doesn't mean that we shouldn't make progress on any front. So let's look at 2015 right now. If we get them to this standard by 2015, they're going to be hard-pressed to say they can't go further than that by 2020. Okay. Right now, you're saying, well, right now you're saying that 35 miles per gallon by 2020 is not a good enough goal. Right. How about 36 by 2015? You know, right. We should be. Good. You know, we should be having some consensus that if they say they can do it, that we'll hold them to that. But we know 36 won't be the standard in 2020. We know it'll be 38, it'll be 39, it'll be 40, 41, 42. So we start at 36, and I think that's probably a good way of having this discussion. Mr. Munger. I'm sorry, Dr. Morisi.
Please forgive me for reversing roles with you, but then that brings me to the next question, is to what do we do when these guys 2 years from now saying, well, we're making all these efforts and all these bad things have happened to us, and we need yet even more money than you have given us so we can meet these goals that you're requiring of us. Because you know what, the reason they wouldn't want to meet them was not because they're not inherently evil people.
No.
But the reality is that the price of gasoline sinks and stays at $1.50 a gallon, and all of a sudden those big pickup trucks start looking good again. And they can make a lot of money out of it.
Can I say this, Dr. Morisi? And again, Ms. Clayburgh already made this point. I'll restate it, which is that in 1975, over the objection of the auto industry, we doubled the fuel economy standards from 13 to 27 miles per gallon. Now, at that point, we had an oil crisis. We had another one in 79, 80. However, as she pointed out, beginning in 1977, when the rules began to be implemented, by the time we reached 1985, 86, we had gone from 13 to 27 miles per gallon. Now, a lot of that in the 80s was as the price of gasoline and a barrel of oil went down to $12 a barrel. But they were under a mandate, a federal mandate. Now, you say, well, what penalties are they going to have imposed if they don't have any money? All of that, I understand everything that you're saying, Dr. Marisi. But it happened once. And then successfully, they blocked any further increase in the fuel economy standards from 1986, 87, all the way until December of 2007, when my amendment passed, raising it to 35 miles per gallon. Now, believe it or not, it had gone backwards to 25 miles per gallon by 2007. So that 10 mile per gallon increase was the best we could do, okay? Now, if there is a problem in the subsequent years, at least we'll have the law on the books.
I agree with you. What I'm saying is watch out for them to come back and say that we need more money to do this.
I understand what you're saying, Dr. Marisi. Okay, the recidivism rate is very high in the auto industry. Okay, if that's your point, I've served in Congress. This is my 33rd year, sitting on the very same committee, the Energy Committee. Okay, so I am aware. I'm actually an eyewitness to each one of the hearings that has been held on the subject for 33 years. I don't think anyone else in the room, with the exception of Ms. Claber, can say that. Okay, so that gives me, a perspective that understands that I could very much look like Charlie Brown with Lucy pulling the football. But that's why you need a law, okay? You don't need a promise. That's her point. And you're helping us to say, let's turn the promise into legislative language that we then attach, and we might not do it this round, but they're coming back again real soon, okay? I've watched over and over and over again, okay? The law actually called for...
Like a kid with an allowance.
You need to attach conditions. That's what we're talking about. And then I think that empowers, Dr. Marisi, the technologists in the companies. That empowers the younger generation. That empowers the people who thus far have been walled out by the people who went to Harvard Business School. And by the way, I love Harvard Business School. I love the Sloan School up in my district. I love them. They're great people. I'd prefer,
Don't you love the Maryland Business School?
I would, excuse me?
Don't you love the the University of Maryland?
I love the University of Maryland Business School.
I want to make sure you get that in.
But each one of them pretty much gets a 3x5 card that shows you how you make money, okay? We're trying to empower the people who go to MIT or to the University of Maryland, okay? That is the Google boy's father over here at the University of Maryland, who is not in the financial sector, but over here in the technological sector, okay? Sergey Brin's father. And say to the technological people at the University of Maryland or at MIT or at Harvard, now you're in control, because they're going to have to talk to you, the people over at the B School or the Sloan School, as to what you're going to have to now talk about in terms of improving the technology, right? Right now, they just straight arm them. They're out of the room. We're not listening to you, We don't have to improve anything, okay? So that's really what we're talking about, right? How do we create a formula that accomplishes that goal? So my goal here is just to find a way of holding them to what they're saying right now they're going to do like an allowance, okay? There's got to be some penalty. There's got to be something you're going to take away. You're grounded, If you don't perform on the allowance, okay, you're grounded for 2 weeks, and then you have to make it stick, right? So we need to find a way of doing that. When we move forward, we just have to accomplish that goal. I'm just going to ask one more quick question right now, and that is that Dr. Marisi, you proposed that when we provide the assistance to the companies, that they perform the R&D and their first large production runs in the United States. The condition would be that beneficiaries share their patents at reasonable cost with other companies who will be here in the United States making vehicles. You suggest that this could attract producers from around the world and rejuvenate the U.S. auto supply chain. Do you think that people would continue to develop these new technologies if the large profit margin disappeared? And I'd like you to just answer that question so that we don't kind of create something that actually doesn't attract anyone to
Well, I think
that fund.
that the reasonable has to be reasonable. If you come up with a great idea and it's worth something, the other car companies can have access to it, but they have to pay for it as well. So that worked in Japan. It worked just fine. That's what they did in the 70s and 80s with their technology program. If we require that Americans drive vehicles with high mileage standards and we provide R&D incentives to develop the products here, I don't think we're going to have much trouble getting. The reason I want to do that is I want to get Toyota, Nissan, and Honda involved because we want access to their technology. We want to encourage them to locate more of what they do here.
Okay, and one of the suggestions on the panel was that these factories that General Motors and Ford and Chrysler have right now that they might not be using in the future might be made available. I think I heard someone say that to people like Mr. Munger and others, okay? So that it just doesn't get shut down, but we move it over to the new companies moving in. Was that you, Mr. Wardle? Somebody made that proposal.
Yes, I certainly believe.
So talk about that concept in the context of Mr. Munger and Tesla and these other new companies.
There is no doubt that these new companies have already worked out the products that we need, and at the same time, the legacy auto industry certainly has a lot of expertise and capability of turning products into high-volume manufactured vehicles. And so I think it would be a missed opportunity if some way was not found of harnessing those idle capabilities in the legacy industry to the benefit of the startup companies, so long as none of the defensive attitudes, if you like, of the legacy industry would dilute in any way the innovation of the startup companies. So it has to be the right relationship so that the best parts of the current auto industry are made available to the most innovative aspects of entrepreneurial startup companies.
Okay, great. And I'll just give you the quote from the White House press spokesperson Perino today, as opposed to building the kind of the promise of the industry into the law. She said, quote, today, if the viability advisor says that they're not making progress, then that company, the automaker, would have to pay the taxpayer back right away. So there's the incentive for everybody to work hard to make this work. Good enough for you, Ms. Clayburgh?
No.
Good enough for you, Mr. Munger?
It's not obvious how you repay a loan when it's a loan you require.
Dr. Marisi, good enough for you?
No, it's not good enough for me. I want more than that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Waddle, good enough for you?
No.
No?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Curls was shaking his head vigorously sideways, so that you know what his answer was. Let me turn now and recognize the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all of the witnesses and some of the testimony that's been given here. And to my colleague, Mr. Cleaver from Missouri, the Detroit Lions are having a rather tough season this year along with the domestic auto industry, but hey, how about those Red Wings? You know, there's been some talk about the CAFE standards. I think uniformity is key. It was interesting for us to note. I realize we sound a little defensive here again. Interesting to note that Nissan got a loophole in the CAFE standards last time. I'm not quite sure how all of that worked out, but I do think uniformity is a key. And I appreciate, and we're going to see how all of this is going to work when you have various states coming up with their own emission standards. And as part of the law, it will preclude the auto industry from any litigation trying to stop that. I do wonder sometimes, I mean, for instance, if you took maybe an industry from California, from Hollywood, I mean, if you were a movie maker and every single state in the union could have their own determination of what the rating was on a movie, how would you market that movie? PG in some states and R's in others and these kinds of things. So I do think uniformity is the key, but I recognize that there is a bit of a double standard here. But my question would be, and I appreciated some of the comments Mr. Wardle was making about in Britain and the experience that you had there when some of the transplants, as we call them here, came into your country. But it seems to me that our nation has not and our Congress has not done as good a job as we should have of having a manufacturing policy, really, or a comprehensive, cohesive industrial policy. For instance, in Britain now we see Ford manufacturing their diesel engine, which is apparently getting can get 65 miles per gallon there, but yet there was a concerted effort to incent people, de-incent them to purchase gasoline and to incent them to purchase diesel as part of sort of the country's policy and through the EU as well. I'm just not quite sure who I'm asking this question of, but it does seem to me that if our nation had a more comprehensive industrial policy and a manufacturing policy, we could advantage ourselves in many ways because of this crisis that we're finding ourselves faced with now. As we're busy putting all of these laws and oversight and et cetera, I think we all want the same thing at the end, and maybe we could look at it in a little broader vision of how we can help our country go forward with such a policy.
Mrs. Miller, we have a manufacturing policy in the United States. We have an anti-industrial policy. It's that simple. Whether we have a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, we get the same Treasury Secretary. We get Bob Rubin in one form or another. And the guys from Wharton on up through the Charles River don't know much about factories, aren't much interested in them, and don't really care very much. Okay? And as a consequence, I've watched this body, I've urged, I've written op-ed articles, I've sent you press releases over and over again about our toleration of the Chinese currency policy and how it is devastating your part of the country. And, you know, nothing ever happens. The inability to move on trade policy has done more damage to the manufacturing base in the United States can be possibly managed by one man or woman, but we've tolerated it. When Wall Street gets in trouble, you guys passed a $700 billion bailout, which gave them essentially all the money they wanted and then some, and whatever you don't give them, the Federal Reserve gives them with virtually no strings. They haven't done any of the responsible things to speak of necessary to reopen credit markets, such as reopening the securitization pipeline from good, sound regional banks to fixed income investors. And that goes on and on and on. So we have a policy. My son, somebody said to me, people don't want to study engineering in this country. They're too lazy. They are not too lazy. There's a reason the finance department is full. The same math that is in an engineering textbook or a physics textbook is in a finance textbook. I know. I studied it. But we have lots of kids who want to study finance because that's where the rewards are in our society, and to a large measure, that's a product of public policy. Engineering doesn't pay out because manufacturing doesn't pay out. Manufacturing doesn't pay out because we have a dumb trade policy.
Mr. Wardle?
Yes, I see a lot of parallels, as I mentioned before, between what happened in the UK and what is happening in Detroit now. Largely because of inept management in the British car industry that refused to acknowledge that overseas companies were developing products that UK consumers actually needed. But one of the mistakes I think that was made in Britain, which hopefully can be avoided in the US, was that the government intervention in the British car industry was of the wrong kind. What we really need here is clear direction and policy from government, which I believe is something that is always needed, which industry can respond to, and which is why I think that first of all we need to set up what I would say is a mobility czar to look at this situation rather than an auto czar, so that it's quite clear what kind of transportation future that we have, so that we know and from that to direct policy, so that everybody knows what the hurdles are that they have to jump over or what the parameters are that they have to operate their businesses in. And so it would be wrong to directly intervene with the existing car industry through too much internal messing around, but the parameters need to be very clear through government legislation and policy. But that needs to come from very clear oversight as to what are the right answers. And that's something that was never established in in Britain in the 70s. Nobody actually stated what the clear objectives were for the rebirth of the British car industry, so it didn't happen.
Mrs. Miller, I'd like to associate myself with both of those remarks and say that I do hope that this committee, and Mr. Chairman, this committee will have a hearing on transportation policy, because we actually don't have a transportation policy in this system, in this country, and the president-elect has just announced that he wants to have a huge infrastructure expenditure. Well, if you're going to spend a huge amount more money on infrastructure, you better figure out what infrastructure you want and what really makes a difference. We have bridges and roads that are in disrepair, admittedly, but we don't have mass transit systems that go to the airport, for example. And one of the provisions in this legislation that you're going to be voting on, Section 13, requires the auto manufacturers to study whether or not they should get involved in producing mass transit type vehicles, whether it's rail or whether it's urban transit, and as a way to expand the scope and the view of their manufacturing activities. And I would urge that this committee hold some very soon hearings, because the Infrastructure Committee, one of the problems with the Congress, it's divided up. The Infrastructure Committee, that's the Public Works crowd, is a different committee than the Commerce Committee, which looks at transportation generally. And I would urge both this committee and the Infrastructure Committee to look at transportation policy and what is it that we really want, what makes a difference. People in this country are really frustrated with the changes that have been made by the airline industry because they're in financial trouble. Now you can't get from here to there without going through 3 different cities in an airplane and changing planes. So there's lots of opportunity here for, in this middle of this crisis as well, for looking at overall transportation policy. I would just like to make one last comment, Ms. Miller, about something you said about the states setting standards. The reason that advocates like myself have favored that is because the lobbies have overtaken the Congress and stopped any improvement in fuel economy from 1990, when we lost a bill in a filibuster by 2 votes that would have had, by 2001, would have required 40 miles per gallon fuel economy, which would have saved this auto industry.
Thank you.
But if I could just say, the way that you can get around having it be variable is the manufacturers meet the highest standard. So if California sets the highest standard, then there are not a lot of different standards. You meet the California standard. It's one standard.
Just one more question with the chair's indulgence, and I want to pick up on what has been talked about with the trade policies and some of the disadvantages that our manufacturing companies have run into as a result of that. And I want to mention about MAG again, and my question is to Mr. Curlis. I think it's important to note MAG really was Excello and Cross and a number of various manufacturers that you've consolidated with. And as you mentioned, you're the only remaining U.S. powertrain supplier to the automotive industry and the 3rd largest machine supplier in the world. And yet, if you go into some of the auto plants of the transplants here, the machinery that they use there, do you find any American-produced machinery in those plants? Or are they produced in their native nations? And if there are no American-produced machinery in those plants, why not?
That's true. From Japan, the Japanese transplants come here, will not buy MAG equipment, and that's our facilities here in the States, in Europe, around the world. We do supply the equipment, though, to people like the Korean transplants here. So, like the Hyundai engine, that is all MAG equipment, and they're producing that engine, which is great. That shows that we can do it. We have the affordability factor to go with putting that equipment in there. But it's very clear the Japanese will not work with us. Now, China's is going to be a different picture again, and that's yet to be decided what's going to come up there. But at this point, I would say there's a good chance we won't get some of that business. On the other hand, we get a great deal of business out of Europe. We get strong business through all the other ones in the United States. And then there's the other companies, the heavy equipment suppliers, the big diesel engines for Caterpillar and Cummins and other companies. And we get all that business as well. So it's just a matter of what country you're really talking about, I think, when you're dealing with these transplants.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express real appreciation for you today. This has been very helpful to me, although I think Dr. Maridi should come here with a bit more passion when you're testifying before Congress. You should
I
have.
was old today, and you should have seen me when I was 35.
With the gentleman, I have the third most Italian district out of 435. So imagine a whole district of people like Dr.
I like this. You don't know how much more I just decided to like you.
Yeah, it's part of it. So I'm used to this. This is a normal conversation.
The way
in my
we are,
district.
sir.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
you need to eat some more pasta.
A friend of mine, Hosea Haywood, said to me yesterday, he's in the automobile industry, and he sells automobiles, and he said that a year ago he could take 12 applications to one of the financing arms, and he'd get 2 or 3 approved. Today he takes 12 and he gets none approved. The crisis that we're in now is a credit crisis, and one of my complaints with the big three is that even if we give them money, even if we make this bridge loan, they're still going to have a problem because GMAC, Chrysler Financing, and Ford Financing are all three requiring a credit score of 700. Yeah, you know where I'm going. Okay. And if there is a credit crisis with the big three, and they all have financing arms, Mr. Munger, how in the world are you going to be able to make it without a financing arm? If we don't figure out a way to put money into the financing arms, maybe the industry can manufacture more cars, but the public still won't be able to buy them because there's no credit. And if you are producing trucks with a unit price of $25,000, you're still going to have a difficulty, and you will have a much more difficult time than the big three. Am I right? Or right?
Well, I hope that by 2012 our credit crisis has passed. But I think you're very accurate in highlighting the issue. Chrysler was actually explicit about the need for TARP funds for Chrysler Financial. There is a differentiation where essentially the auto industry funds itself out of those affiliated lending arms, and they aren't able to lend because they don't have access to capital. They've been hurt by the same things. And so that's why you're seeing them all apply to become bank holding companies or do other actions to activate their access to credit to facilitate the flow of vehicles. So you do have the manufacturing businesses that are losing money, but there is need for assistance on the financial side. The risk profile is very different for a financing entity, and that's much more of a TARP situation.
Well, where will the potential customers come from? I mean, where will they get financing for your vehicles?
We have a commercial offering, so it's a totally different financing situation.
So they'll go to depository banks.
They have their own lines of credit, and there's some other entities that provide credit to that market. But it will still benefit from a smoother, more operating credit market, but we have some time to get there.
All right. Mr. Water.
At the risk of sounding like an idealist, I would point out that we see that there are aspects of future mobility systems where direct ownership of vehicles and access to mobility systems is not as necessary as it is today. I think there is a good case for looking at, in the longer term, how people can access personal mobility without actually having to make a large loan in the first place through leasing programs or other forms of shared ownership.
Dr. Marisi?
Yeah. The securitization problem is really at the root of the automobile financing issue. And that is that historically the finance companies associated with the Detroit Three made the better loans. They're raising their credit scores because they have less money to lend, so they're just giving it to their best customers. But if we don't solve the securitization problem, we simply will not solve the problem of the automobile industry or the student loan issue or what have you. And that has to be solved if we're going to pull out of this recession. It's really not I know the scope of this committee, but we need to put conditions on the money we're giving the banks. So they'll do this. For example, the banks buying smaller banks does not increase the deposit base. And the deposit base in the United States is insufficient to finance all the auto loans, the home mortgages, and what have you, business loans. It has to be financed by accessing fixed income investors. We haven't imposed those conditions. The Federal Reserve hasn't imposed those conditions. And until it's prepared to do so, we're not going to solve anybody's problems. It's that simple. But I'm hopeful that by 2012, if we haven't solved this problem by 2012, we're in the soup in a much bigger way than we've discussed today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to give each one of you 1 minute to summarize to the Select Committee and to the nation as to what you think should happen in terms of our automotive industry and its relationship with the federal government, the taxpayers of our country, and their justifiable expectations if they are going to become partners with the big three financially. We'll go in reverse order of our opening statements. We'll begin with you, Mr. Curlis.
Thank you. First off, I want to reiterate that bailout funds need to be made available to the big three. Certainly, for the short term, we have an economic crisis going on here. And a lot of the discussions we've had here today has been about the next generation vehicle and the standards and the laws and where do we go for the future and can we get our milestones in and all that. And we need to strive for those things. But let's face it, if we keep producing automobiles and there's no one out there to buy them, we're just going to watch that money go down the tube. Not because the automotive companies did a bad thing, it's because our whole economy did a bad thing. And so we need to look at both aspects of it and maybe do some separation there and make sure that we look at both the short term and the long term. So from Meg's viewpoint or from a manufacturing company's viewpoint, we need those companies there. We need the big three. We need the volume. We need to see these millions of automobiles being produced, not just 50,000 or 80,000 or something like that. So I want to encourage us to try to put more tax incentives in, encourage us to provide other types of incentives to the entire supply chain that's working with the automotive industry. And let's see if we can get this off the ground as far as looking at the next generation while we solve our economic crisis here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Curlis, very much. Mr. Waddle.
Yes. I recommend funding for a powerful, visionary, multidisciplinary commission to define an innovative and far-reaching mobility vision for America over the next few decades. Funding in investment in building a far-reaching integrated transportation network across the nation, which a revitalized American car industry could participate in. And financial assistance to help the innovative startup companies get their products to market. And when these three things are achieved, then we can talk about the necessary financial assistance for the current auto industry as it adapts to a new business model that will support this overall vision. And I'd also like to say that my colleagues and I would be very happy to work with the committee to try and define what those requests or initiatives would be to help the so-called little guys in the automotive industry right now.
We thank you, Mr. Waddle, very much, and your Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. Back in 1962, when the Beach Boys were singing the Little Old Lady from Pasadena, go, Granny, go, Granny, go, Granny, go, no one could catch her vehicle, huh? Hopefully, out of Pasadena will come that new vehicle that we can be selling around the world that is a model for our future, our 21st century, not 100 days, as Dr. Marisi said, but 100 years. Dr. Marisi.
As a realist and not an idealist, whether we are talking about a bailout or a pre-packed structured Chapter 11, it's important to provide the industry with the right incentives to create a market here for high mileage vehicles through higher mileage requirements for cars, to encourage the rapid deployment of higher mileage vehicles with a clunker subsidy to make it possible for people to trade in and get rid of the low mileage vehicles as quickly as possible, to provide development assistance for both vehicle manufacturers and component makers, and require them to share their knowledge with one another at a good return so that they are encouraged to continue developing technology, and to require vehicles and components benefiting from such incentives to be made here, at least in their first commercial runs, so that we have an industrial policy that is positive. And finally, to do something about currency manipulation and Asian trade policies that hurt our industries.
Thank you, Dr. Morisi. Mr. Munger.
We're at a unique time where industrial need is aligning with the national interest. It's in our interest to have an industry that builds more efficient vehicles to lead to cleaner air, reduced carbon emissions, freedom from imported oil, and an industry that leads in innovation. It's important to link accelerating efficiency with any bailout that goes along to the Detroit 3. The industry has the skills and the knowledge to do things beyond what they've done to date. There's also existing funding mechanisms in place to help the industry and to help smaller companies achieve those goals. Companies like Bright Automotive are prepared to accelerate this process independently of what's happening in Detroit, but it's important for the nation that we work together, come up with a solution, and achieve a more independent and oil-free country.
Thank you, Mr. Munger. Ms. Clayburgh. Microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify. In the short term, I think that this legislation ought to pass as rapidly as possible, but I would urge the inclusion of a goal for fuel economies we've discussed, and also that the citizens be more involved in this process by being defined as interested parties, because we certainly are. We're the ones who are supposed to buy the vehicles, right? And that's the one group that's been left out of this legislation, and also left out are any requirements for them to take into consideration when they do this redesign, the safety rules that are pending in the Department of Transportation. The longer-term issue, I think, is huge. I think you've got some great recommendations today. I agree with preserving the green car factory fund so that it is the full measure of the $25 billion, so that it can support innovative companies such as those that we've heard from today, and that the stimulus package include refunding that money so that it's available, and that a transportation policy be looked at in the course of discussing the infrastructure future of this nation in terms of transportation. And I think that can only help the U.S. auto industry, and particularly if it gets into some of the mass transit issues. And finally, I would say that we need more innovation as well about what we do in terms of personal transportation. There have been proposals on the table, for example, to not allow cars into the inner city and to have people jump into free, available. You put a couple of quarters in the box and get into an electric car, and that's all that can come into the city and get rid of some of the pollution. And so there's an encouragement for people to think themselves differently about what kind of car they want and how they use their car. That's going to certainly influence the industry as well.
Thank you, and we thank each of you. Now, some people are saying, can we do this? Are we being unrealistic? And I remember back as the chairman of the Telecommunications Committee back in 1991, 92, 93, 94, when I was introducing legislation to move from narrowband to broadband. The telephone companies, the big incumbents, they said, we can't do it. The cable companies, going to be very difficult. Now, mind you, the telephone companies had already invented these broadband technologies 15 years before and had won awards in basic research for their invention, but they had not deployed them yet. And so when finally that law passed in 1996, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, it gave a lot of power to people who wanted to innovate, because there was a brand new competitive paradigm created in the telecommunications sector. If someone told you that 10 years later the new language would be Google, eBay, Amazon, YouTube, and that a younger generation wouldn't know anything but that language just 10 years later, you would have said that's completely unrealistic. But what had happened was there was, because of that law, an unleashing of innovation, of competitiveness, that created between 2 and 4 million new jobs in our country. I'm very proud of that. I think the same thing is going to happen here in the energy and the transportation sector. I think if we get the model correct, we're not going to be trying to put a man on the moon, as Mr. Munger said. The technology is largely there. We're talking about batteries. We're talking about technologies that are much more prosaic than that which President Kennedy challenged us to invent in the 1960s, to put a man on the moon and to return them. So I think that this is a great opportunity for our country disguised as a crisis. Because if we don't meet this challenge in a timely fashion, we will be importing all of these vehicles from India, from China, from Japan, and from Europe. And that would be the tragedy. So we actually have this warning, hopefully in time, for us to change the way in which we view our manufacturing sector and what we can do in order to meet this marketplace of 6 billion people who look at us as the innovators. We are 4% of the population in the world. The 96% of the rest of the world sees us as the technological giant. That's why they want their children to go to our colleges and our graduate schools, because they think we are the best. We must now meet those expectations. If we do so, then I believe that 10 years from now we'll look back and we will have actually put us on a path to solve the global warming and energy independence issues that we have ignored for an entire generation. It's the kind of advice that you have been giving our Select Committee today, however, that the leaders of our country must listen to if we are to accomplish that goal. But if they do, I am confident, like we did in the telecommunications sector, that we can empower the Sergey Brins, the sons of professors at the University of Maryland, to go out and to reinvent the way in which we communicate. And with that, a final compliment to the University of Maryland. I thank you all for testifying, and this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Joan, it was nice to meet you. It's nice to meet you, yes. Well, I completely agree with a lot of the things that you said.
Me too.
Have you done this? Yeah.
Not at this level. You did a great job.
David, how are you? Nice to see you.
Do you have a card? Write me and I'll put you on. If you fell off, it's because there was an accident.
Oh, because I did fall.